Hey, this is part 2 of my table saw rebuild. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, you should go watch that now. For context, I'll provide a link somewhere. Now let's move on to making the new table saw fence system. These are the main components that I bought somewhat at random. And by the way, I do mean that. I never work off of plans or make plans for the vast majority of my projects. I just work off the top of my head because that's how I like to do it. These two bits of angle here are 3/16 inch thick. They're 2 inches by 2 inches. These will form the front and back rails of the table saw fence system. This tube here is 2 inches by 2 inches. Again, the same thickness, 3/16 inch. This will butt up against the front rail angle here, like this. This is where the table saw fence will clamp onto. This tube here, same as this tube except shorter. This is going to be the main center of the actual fence itself. And then this little bit of angle here is how the fence is going to clamp onto the clamping rail. This will all make more sense as I start to put it together, and there's going to be some more smaller components involved. So let's get to work. And here's the two rails haphazardly bolted in place. To make the front one fit, I had to file out a couple of holes just a tiny bit because I drilled them just a tiny bit off center. To make the back rail fit, I had to cut a bit of relief out of the table saw box. Oh yeah, and while you weren't looking, I painted the table saw box white, but you could probably tell that because it's, white now. Also, while I had this whole thing apart for painting, I took the extra time to realign the blade so that the blade is perfectly parallel with the miter slots. Now let's take this front rail off so I can weld a big old tube to it. The rails are done now, front and back, and they're fully bolted in place, and as you can plainly see, I gave them a lick of paint. This is starting to look like a real table saw now. Not the poopy little contractor table saw it truly is. Now let's move on to making the fence, starting with this little piece of angle right here. Clamp onto the rail, like so. I'm going to bend these just a little tiny bit to give them a little bit of preload. Now, this goes onto here like this. Use a C-clamp to smash it down. Then, using these 3 holes I just drilled, plug weld it in place. This piece I just made is the clamping part of the fence. It sits on this rail like this, and combined with the cam lever on the back of the fence that I have yet to make, this is what clamps it to this rail. And the reason it has drilled and tapped holes in the angle and flat bar welded to the bottom of it is to provide adjustment, to make sure the table saw fence is exactly parallel with the blade and exactly perpendicular to the surface of the table saw table. The way it works is you have a set screw, I'm just using a bolt for now, go through this threaded hole and push against the flat bar to raise and lower each side of the angle iron to change the angle of the fence. There's going to be pieces of plastic epoxy on the bottom here so it rides smoothly against this rail, but none of that matters because I screwed this part up. You may have already noticed how. The 2 bits of flat bar on the bottom of this that are supposed to push out and provide adjustment, I welded too close together and they overlap. So one piece of flat bar can push out and adjust, but the other one just pushes against the other piece of flat bar. So I made a fancy piece of metal that does nothing, but that's okay. I just need to go out, get some more angle iron and make a new one. Correctly this time, hopefully. And here's the new one I made. I made it exactly the same way as I made the old one, with one exception. I made it with a slightly bigger piece of angle iron. So now the flat bar springy thingies are spaced further apart and don't overlap whatsoever, which is important. Then, since I made this one correctly, I topped it off by cutting down some UHMW plastic on the bandsaw to 1/8 inch thick and epoxied 4 little pads to the runners so that this thing can glide smoothly on the rail right here. Now let's move on to welding the fence onto this. This is the piece I'm going to use as the actual fence itself, just a piece of 2x2 square tubing. As you can see, I've already welded an end cap on the end of it. Ground it flush, painted over it, made it look like it came out of the factory this way. You'd never know by looking at it, but this was about 5 years worth of grinding. Something like that. It's a rough guess. Anyway, I just need to lay this on the table. I've got this piece of plywood wedged into the miter slot so I can line up the fence with that, get it lined up over here, and then put this clampy bit underneath it, center it all down, get everything lined up, and then weld these two pieces together. And by that I mean tack these two pieces together and then weld them somewhere that isn't on the table. Let's do that now. Well, that's done. Now let's move on to making the cam lock clampy-go-lucky bit on the back here. These two bits of flat bar here are the only thing I'm welding in place. I just have these two bits of 1/2 inch round clamped in place to provide accurate spacing. To make sure this whole assembly doesn't wiggle around on this table saw fence, because I just have it sitting there for now, I'm going to apply a couple drips of CA glue. That'll hold. Oh, I already bumped it. It'll provide hold until I can weld it up. I'm drilling a hole off center in this 1/2 inch piece of round because this will be the cam portion of the cam lock. Here's how the cam lock mechanism is going to work. This little slightly bent piece of flat bar here with 2 holes drilled into it and a UHMW pad epoxy to it is going to be the spring, and it bolts into these 2 drilled and tapped holes that I drilled and tapped on the end cap of the fence. This little piece of 1/2 inch round here with the hole drilled through it off center is the cam itself. I chose 1/2 inch round because I have some 1/2 inch ID bearings that slip over it like so. And the bearings will be pressing against this spring and locking the fence down. This cam will pivot on a 1/4 bolt that goes right through it. Lost a bearing. And it'll rotate with the handle. So this is the, assuming the spring is on this side, this is the lock position. This is the unlock position. Obviously in the future I'll be using a real handle and not a pair of vice grips. But I have to get everything set up first. Now the challenge is where to drill the through hole for this 1/4 bolt. Let's test it with the vice grip handle. This is legitimately my first time ever testing it. It shouldn't clamp down all the way because I moved the bearing cam thing back a little bit so that I can have some adjustment room for these pads up here. But let's try it anyway. I don't know, that's pretty solid. I can see now that my cam is off center though. I drilled the hole through it crooked. It's okay, I make a new cam. Much better. It's more aligned. Now let's make a handle. That's better, but it needs more walnut. In addition to this turned walnut handle, I also did a couple other minor things to the fence while you weren't looking. Most notably, I painted the fence poorly. I also painted this little cam piece here and cut about an 1/8 inch off each end of it where it interfaces with these two pieces of flat bar. I then replaced those pieces that I cut off with two little custom sized pieces of UHMW to act as bushings between this cam piece and the flat bar here. There were some horrible metal on metal contact sounds happening, and now that is completely gone. It's plastic on metal contact sounds now. I welded this tiny little piece of metal down here to act as a positive stop for the handle in the down position. I epoxied another UHMW pad on the bottom of the fence here so it can glide smoothly over the table surface, like this. I installed the final set screws into the clampy bit and actually set them so the fence is now perfectly parallel with the blade and it is the perfect height off of the table at both ends. Lastly, I drilled and tapped 4 holes on each side of this main fence rail here on which to attach the side rails of the fence, which will be made out of Baltic birch. Speaking of which, let's make the first ever test cut with this new fence system, which will be the Baltic birch that I'm going to use for the fence rails here. I'm excited. Well, I discovered the first problem with my fence system here. This part of the fence sits just slightly higher than the table of the table saw. So it interferes with the wood that I pass through here. And I mean just slightly higher. It's only a smidge too high. Now I can fix this by just adjusting these adjustment set screws up here so that the fence sits a little bit lower, but then the problem is the set screws themselves will be higher than the table of the table saw. So to fix that, I guess I just need some shorter set screws. Not ideal, but I put this rail up a little bit too high and I should have seen this coming. So I'll have to work with my mistakes. I'll see you in a little bit. So the temporary solution I've come up with to fix my clearance issue here is just to remove these top 2 set screws. That way the set screws won't be in the way because they're not there. And without these adjustment set screws in place, the fence is adjusted down low enough so that this part of the fence is now lower than the top of the table saw table. Not by much, but it's lower by enough to get the job done, again, temporarily. Now, naturally, this is not a permanent solution because without these set screws in place, I have no adjustment. Miraculously, though, this temporary piece of MDF I bolted to the side of the fence rail is somehow perfectly 90 degrees to the table without the adjustment, but this end of the fence is much lower than this end of the fence, so I would like to get that adjustment back at some point. I think my permanent solution for this is going to have to be making an entirely new fence, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to use this setup for now. Now let's make an actual first test cut. An actual cut using this Baltic birch to make permanent fence rails for the side of this. I say permanent, but if I have to make an entirely new fence, it's not going to be that permanent, is it? Anyway, let's make a cut. That looks lovely. And I finished it off with a coat of paste wax that I buffed on there. Now, let's make some extension wings to fill these holes. I'll be making both extension wings out of this, which is 2 3/4 inch sheets of MDF that I have glued together to make a 1.5 inch sheet of MDF. I have one for each wing, and I'll be bolting it to the table saw through the through holes on the rail using bolts into threaded inserts that I'll have to put into place on these sheets of MDF. Okay, this isn't working. This is attempt 2. I re-drilled all the holes, put in all new threaded inserts, took out the old ones, and it still didn't work properly. It may look like this extension wing is mounted to the table, and it kind of is, but about 1/3 of the holes were misaligned enough that I had to jam the bolts in place, and another 1/3 were so misaligned that I couldn't fit a bolt in there at all. I don't know if the drill bit wandered when I was drilling the holes for the threaded inserts, or if I didn't drill the holes accurately enough that the bolt goes through in the first place, but whatever the case is, I'm abandoning threaded inserts as my way of mounting the extension wings to the table. And on top of that, threaded inserts jammed in the end of MDF probably wasn't all that strong to begin with. So what I'm going to use instead to mount these extension wings is this. This is 1.5 by 1.5 by 1.5 aluminum channel. I'm going to use this stuff to mount the extension wings to the table saw in a way that you'll see in a second. So just follow along. You ready for this? I don't think you're ready for this. Fits like a glove. I just painted it in polyurethane. It's still wet, but I couldn't wait to slot this in place. Because look at it. This looks good. Now for the other wing. Oh, yes. Beautiful. Frankly, I'm glad the whole threaded insert thing didn't work out because, well, this looked good. I am very satisfied with how this turns out. It's functional too or whatever, but it looks good. That's the main thing. Now, I did mess up a couple of times when making the mounting brackets for this extension wings, i.e. these channel pieces here. First thing I did was cut 2 pieces of channel incorrectly. Then I had to scrap them. Thankfully, I bought an extra length of channel, so I had to dive into that extra length to cut some new pieces. And then, with the pieces all cut correctly, I then proceeded to drill all the mounting holes in the wrong place. Again, just like I did with the whole threaded insert thing. I don't know what's wrong with me. For some reason, I had it in my head that the mounting holes needed to be drilled 1 inch down from the top. That was not correct. They needed to be drilled down 1.25 inches from the top. And to make sure I didn't drill the holes in the wrong place again, because I had to flip the pieces over to have fresh, clean metal to drill into, I lined up the channel in place where they needed to be and then marked through with a Sharpie, marked through the mounting holes where I needed to drill to make sure I drilled the holes in exactly the right place. And then with that done, I encountered a whole new issue because I drilled the mounting holes 1.25 inches down from the top of the channel. This channel is only 1.5 inches wide. So the bolt hole went right next to the bottom lip of the channel, so I had to cut a notch out of the bottom of the channel to allow clearance for the nut to screw onto the bolt. So there's several notches cut out of the bottom of this channel to make clearance for the nuts on the bolts. All of that was very annoying, but in the end, I got it mounted in place, and you'd never know that I screwed anything up unless you look at these superfluous holes on the side here that are visible on the top, because again, I had to flip the rail over after I drilled the holes in the wrong place. But now it's all in place and all is good. Now let's move on to the next thing, which is what? I'll tell you what. The next thing is to finish the table saw. And here it is, in done form. And here I am, in done form. I did 3 things of note off camera, the most obvious of which is I made this little outfeed table. It also serves as the topper for the open part of the table saw box on the back to fully enclose it for dust collecting purposes. This is nothing special. It's just a small sheet of MDF with 2 grooves cut into it to extend the miter slots, and it's held in place by 4 screws to make it easy to remove in case I need to get inside the box. Most likely because I dropped the arbor nut off of the end and I need to get inside the box to get that. There's also some strips of plywood underneath it, cut to the right height to raise it up to the right level, but again, nothing special. Then, to fix my lack of a riving knife issue, I made a 0 clearance insert plate with a splitter. More specifically, I made 2 of them with splitters at 2 different heights. Now, this is not as good as a riving knife. It doesn't raise and lower with the blade, it does not tilt with the blade, but this is a significant safety improvement over having nothing at all. I should have done this a long time ago, really. And the last thing I did off camera was I added a tape measure to my table saw fence. I know, you're blown away. But really, I did this a little bit differently than most table saws do it. On most table saws, you've got the tape measure that's fixed in place and the pointer that adjusts back and forth so you can adjust your measurements and where your fence is pointing to. But I did it the other way around. My pointer is fixed in place and it's the whole tape measure that moves back and forth. The pointer is just a little tiny piece of mahogany that I had left over, and I whittled it down to a sharp point and glued it in place on the table saw fence with some CA glue. The tape measure is stuck to a little piece of Baltic birch that I cut down to width, and it's held in place on the table saw rail with 8 very powerful neodymium magnets. That means it just snaps into place and locks itself there, and it will not move on its own unless you give it a little tap on each end with a hammer, which is how I do my table saw measurement fence adjustments. Just tap it on either end lightly with a wacky stick until the pointer is pointing exactly where it needs to point. So that's how I did my tape measure setup. And here it is, my completed, fully rebuilt table saw. The only thing that's left is the table and the arbor assembly and the motor and the knobs. Okay, there's a lot of stuff that's original to the saw, but everything else around it is new. Yes, I'm very happy with this. I'm gonna make a lot of cool stuff with this saw. Now, as with any project, I still have some things I want to do to it, but they will be future videos. For instance, I would like to add drawers and other organizated storage to this big open chasm of a box down here. I want to add a homemade router lift to this extension wing to have a router table, because currently I don't have a router table at all. I'd like to add a blade guard / overarm dust collection to suck up dust and cover the blade. And probably some other stuff that I haven't thought of yet, but those will be future videos. Also, at some point I need to make a new table saw fence for reasons that I described earlier in the video, because I screwed up the height adjust mechanism and it doesn't clear the table. But since the table saw fence works perfectly fine as is, I expect it to be several months, maybe even years, before I get around to making a new table saw fence, because there would be no immediate benefit and there would be a lot of work to make that whole fence all over again. So that will be, but I will make an update video, a very short update video, when I do get around to making that fence to show you what I changed to make it more betterer. So that's it. Thank you for watching. My workbench is still a mess. Hopefully you found these videos entertaining, maybe even helpful, although I doubt that last one. So I'll see you next time. Make sure you subscribe to Aging Wheels and Underdone. Just subscribe to everything I do. See you later.